Hello and welcome to Never Mind the Bar Charts with myself, Mark Pack. This time, I'm delighted to welcome back to the show someone who, for reasons I cannot remember, I once called Political Science's answer to Simon Cowell. More traditionally, he's also known as Professor Phil Cowley. Welcome back, Phil.
Welcome. I think you said I was to writers of politics books what Simon Cowell was to singing. And I think that was a compliment, but who knows?
I think we should bank it as a compliment, but it is definitely true that you are the writer of politics books because you, in fact, have a new book out called The Smallest Room in the House. So what's the new book all about?
Well, it's a collection of 50 short essays, each trying to unpick some aspect of British politics, mostly electoral or parliamentary politics, and to try to show why things that maybe you thought were a bit dry are actually really quite interesting.
And do you think you succeed?
Well, I mean, I hope I succeed. I mean, it was great fun to write, which is sometimes, a good clue as to whether it's going to be good to read. Although not always. And so far the reviews have been very good. But I suppose that's for readers rather than me to say.
And the reason for the title of the book, which I must admit, it took me a little while to twig to, but maybe I'm just a slow dullard. But
okay, so there are a couple of reasons for the book title. The first was that when I sent it to the publishers, and obviously you hope they'll come back and say, or I sent the pitch to the publishers, you hope they'll come back and say, this is a book of the year, this is a Pulitzer, etc., etc. And actually, they came straight back and said it'll make a great toilet book. Which on one level is not what you want to hear, but on another level, actually maybe they were right, and so we kind of decided when it came to titling it, we'd lean into that aspect of it. We'd lean into the toilet book element. It's also in passing a reference to the fact that many of the chapters, not quite all, but most of them began life as articles in Parliament's magazine, the House magazine, where I write a column. So it's a sort of allusion to that. But I begin it actually with a story about how my political research career, 30 something years ago, when I used to come down to Westminster to interview MPs when I was a postgraduate student. I mean, people today complain about Westminster being inaccessible, but then there was literally nowhere for a visitor to eat lunch in the precincts. So because it was too time consuming to leave and then come back in, I used to take in sandwiches in my briefcase and I would sit in the WC in the lower waiting hall, lock the door, and eat my sandwiches as quickly as possible. And it's really strange how that rather humbling moment has stayed with me. And because whenever I'm having difficulty with research or whatever it is, I find myself thinking that at least I'm no longer having to eat my lunch sat on the toilet.
It's one of those things that at the time must have seemed very smart and sensible and logical. But also you look back at it and think, what on earth was I going through in that phase of my life?
Well, indeed. I was just very grateful that at no point did anyone sort of think, what on earth is going on in there? I mean, or it could have been one of those sort of scandals.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, but there's actually Central London used to be like that more generally. When I worked at Lib Dem HQ, which is just around the corner from the Houses of Parliament, between, 2000 and 2009, there was basically one cafe within 15 minutes walk. And now, I mean, try to walk in central London for 15 minutes without passing more than half a dozen cafes.
I think that's partly true, but also, of course, what the big kicker here, it wasn't just that, although that was true. There really were not very many good places to grab a bite to eat in Westminster at the time. But it was also that you have to get in and out past security. And then, as now, that can take quite a long time. And what did for me once was I got stuck behind, I'd been in the morning, I'd gone out to get lunch, I went back in the afternoon and I got stuck behind a disabled rights protest who were deliberately making a thing about how difficult it was for them to get into the building, and with the result that I didn't get in for like 2 hours. And that was the point at which I realized that, there was no way I could leave the building and then go back in. I had to, once I was in the precincts, I had to stay there. But anyone who knows me knows that I cannot survive without lunch. And so there was a need to break that.
Yeah. So what's your favorite chapter in the book? And I should say, you're not allowed to pick chapter 23, which is the one that you have mentioned on other occasions, but because I don't want this podcast to be censored by the, podcast moderation gods. So anyone who is puzzled by that reference, the moment you pick up the book and turn to chapter 23, you'll understand. So what's your second favorite chapter after?
So I think it's quite difficult to choose a favorite chapter because it's a bit like choosing a sort of favorite child. So I'm going to be cheeky.
That was going to be my next question, so you can ready yourself.
Okay, I'm going to choose two. I'm going to choose one of them, which is about Brexit and fish and chip shops. And it's based on, and it's probably worth saying that all the chapters almost are based on an academic study or a couple of academic studies. This one is based on a study which looked at the relationship between the Brexit vote and the type of fast food restaurants that existed in a constituency or a region, and found a very clear relationship between the propensity of a place to have fish and chip shops as the type of takeaway that was most common, and the Leave vote. So to give you the most easiest example, Yorkshire and Humberside, which is the region of the UK in which chip shops are most common, had a 58% Leave vote. London, where chip shops make up under 8% of the fast food restaurants, the Leave vote was down to 40%. And that relationship holds at a constituency level. It's not most of the paper is much more sophisticated than I've just indicated. And it holds for other cuisine. So they test Japanese restaurants, for example, where the relationship is the other way round, whether places are more cosmopolitan and so on. And I like it both because at some point someone has had to download a data set of every type of fast food restaurant in Britain and merge it with constituency boundaries, which I sort of task for which one has to have admiration, but also because it's a really clever way of illustrating the nature of the Brexit vote, right? I mean, we could sit here and go back and forth about, the percentage of social group A, B that lived in an area and so on. You can, once you say to people, places with more chippies tended to vote Brexit, that's a really nice, clear way of cutting through. It's an imaginative way of demonstrating something really quite important. The second one, I think, is one of my favorites, is a chapter on pledges. And it starts with the fact that, despite the fact that you will often hear that political parties never do what they promise they say they're going to do, in fact, study after study has found that they are remarkably good at implementing most of the things they promise to do. If you take a party's manifesto, and after they've been in power for 4 or 5 years, check, they will have done almost all of the things that they say they are going to do. But I particularly like a recent study which looked at the relative importance of the things that parties say they are going to do. And in particular, Theresa May's government elected in 2017, which showed that the public do clearly differentiate between types of promises. And so Theresa May's problem was not that she didn't actually, despite being in power for not that long after 2017, and despite not having a majority, she did actually manage to do most of the things in her manifesto. It's just she didn't manage to do the things that mattered to the public, the things that were considered to be important by members of the public. So, I mean, in some ways, this is a more straightforward, maybe in some ways less imaginative piece of research, but it taps into a sort of central question about whether parties do what they say they are going to do.
So thinking about each of those in turn, I mean, the fish and chips one, reading that chapter a few days ago reminded me that was one of the variables in at least the early versions of the YouGov MRP model. I don't know if they still have the number of fish and chip shops in a constituency as a variable. They certainly used to, presumably for very similar reasons. I do wonder, though, whether... So another correlation, who knows, obviously a big question mark about causation, but another correlation that is quite similar is about levels of passport ownership in the UK. In the one of the oddities about the distribution of people without passports in the UK is they're predominantly in coastal areas, which is not instinctively what you might necessarily expect. You might think, well, people nearer the coast are more like you. But when you step back and then think about actual areas of affluence, nearness to airports, so it begins to make a bit more sense. But what it does mean is I think you've got coastal areas that tended to vote Leave, more likely to vote Leave, more likely to vote UKIP as well previously, and those two things almost certainly are connected, more likely to have fish and chip shops, less likely to have passports. Is how confident are you that the fish and chip shops is not just in that sense? So
what's quite interesting about the paper is that when you control for other variables, fish and chip shop remains as a variable even after you control for some of the other social demographic characteristics that you might control for, which indicates that it's not merely a reflection of other types of. It is actually about the type of place. And of course, whilst it is true that both the Brexit vote and the parties connected with it have always done well in coastal areas, they don't just do well in coastal areas. And in fact, this paper identifies what they call a fish and chip belt, which runs through sort of large parts of northern England, in which the chip shop is the dominant type of takeaway restaurant. So it's speaking to something beyond that. Now, obviously, it's not. Just to be clear, it's not that the fish and chips are the causal. They're not the thing that's making you. It's not eating fish and chips that makes you, but it is a proxy for something else, and something else that is not being called by the other variables that often feature in these models.
And yes, and I don't know how typical my instinctive imagination is, but if you ask me to picture a high street with a fish and chip shop on, I can do that in a quite sort of distinctive way. There's a sort of image that immediately comes to mind. Well, if you ask me to imagine a high street with a Italian restaurant on or a coffee shop, just there's a bundle of different, there does seem to be instinctively something that fish and chip shops epitomize. But lovely, there's one of the things I like about the book is you have you do give the references so people can go and dig into.
Absolutely. I mean, if you find yourself thinking, "Hang on, I don't believe this," you can download it and read it yourself. And actually, there are a couple of places in the book where I offer maybe alternative explanations or potential criticisms of pieces of work. So I think that's an important thing when reading some of this work is not necessarily just to treat it as gospel, but be prepared to think about alternative explanations.
But that does, I guess, lead on to the one thing that I ended up having a little bit of doubt about, having read a good chunk of the book, not quite read it all yet. I've not been to the toilet often enough since my copy arrived. But which is that what you do, I think, really well is popularize proper, rigorous academic research, and so the underlying intellectual foundations look very solid for what you're saying. But it's notable, I think, that in science in general, there's been a lot of controversy about the quality of science, the quality of science papers, and so on. In social science, there's been the whole replication crisis. There's a lot of debate about, the reliance on measures of statistical significance and are they misused? And so in lots of other areas, you have statistically rigorous papers, but in a context where the profession is, if not in crisis, but has significant bouts of serious self-doubt as to how solid all of this is. But all of those controversies seem to have passed political science by. Now, your answer might be that, well, that's because political scientists are particularly good and rigorous at their work. Or is it that, the controversies have not really gained traction, but perhaps they should have, and so perhaps we should just have a bit more doubt about how solid all of this is? Perhaps the problem is that there aren't enough big debates amongst political scientists that cause people to want to find reasons to pull apart each other's research. But yeah, how confident do you feel looking at all of the problems in other areas about your own sort of political science domain?
So I think that they're a really good series of questions. Let me start, I suppose, by saying that, I mean, you're right. Part of the point of the book was to try to take these studies, which are maybe not are unread, but maybe underread in living in academic journals, and bring them out to a wider audience. And when doing so, one of my sort of house rules, bluntly, was that if I came across a piece of work that I didn't think was very good, then I just didn't write about it. It wasn't that I didn't think it was right, given where I was originally writing these columns, to use the column to slag off bits of work. So first of all, in terms of the stuff in the book, there's a little bit of selection going on. But in general, the point about bad science, forged papers, and so on, I mean, I wish I could say that it was that political science are all fabulous and there's never going to be any of that going on. But I don't think that's very likely. I mean, not least because there have been some cases of, even straightforward fraud. There was a quite a famous case recently in a paper that got published in Science about the effect of canvassing, where basically it was revealed after a little bit of time that the data had been completely fabricated. And, I suspect that is not the only one like that. Equally, though, I suspect there's probably not many more, at least as blatant and downright fraudulent as that. I think, if I can use a sort of political comparison, it's pretty a little bit like voter impersonation. So when the Conservatives were trying to bring in, voter ID, people kept saying, but there's so few cases in which people have been found to be impersonating people at the polling station. To which the obvious response is that unless it's the only crime where the police catch every single person who's doing it, there must be more than we know about. But at the same time, there can't be that many more than we know about, because if it was really widespread, we would, if there would be cases would have started to come out in huge numbers. And I suspect this is the same. It's a regretful thing to say, but I suspect if you put a gun to my head, there are probably other cases of fraudulent work out there, even if I hope not very many. More common, though, I think, is for mistakes. And in fact, I do talk about this in one chapter. I use a case of a quite famous Austrian study into votes at 16, which claimed to find what they called a habituation effect, whereby if the voter voted early at 16, they then carried on voting more later on, as opposed to someone who got the ballot at 18 or plus, only a few years after the paper had been published, for someone else to try to replicate it and find that there was a massive methodological problem in the original paper, and it didn't stack up at all. And when they did it with the correct data, they found the effect vanished. What I liked about that one, and why I thought that was okay to write about, despite my rule that I wouldn't criticize people, is that the authors of that paper, when confronted with the mistake, and it was a genuine mistake, fessed up. They retracted the paper. They explained what had happened. They didn't try and bluff it out or double down. And that's how science, political science, or science more generally, I think, should work when there's a mistake. So there will be other cases like that as well.
Yeah.
Where I think there are two more widespread cautionary notes, which I think actually do come out a bit in the book, one in particular. The first is about replication, but not maybe in the sense of I want to replicate this and know that if it's genuine or not. It is that our knowledge of lots of these things is often quite patchy. Funding is slim and time is even slimmer. And so let's say, for example, that we did, to take one of your favorite topics, a study of chocolate. Does chocolate encourage activists? And we find that it does. And that gets written up as chocolate encourages activists. But what we've probably actually found is more limited. We found that chocolate, or at least that type of chocolate, encouraged activists of that party at that particular time, in that particular country, under those very particular circumstances. Maybe 5 years later it wouldn't, or maybe in a different country it wouldn't. But if Professor Bloggs has managed to get some money to look at that originally, it's unlikely that Professor Smith is going to come along and run another study of chocolate under different circumstances. And I do sometimes worry that some of the studies, I hope maybe not some of those in the book, but some in general, are finding what might be one-off effects or coincidental effects under those particular circumstances that wouldn't hold more generally. The other cautionary note, which I found when I was writing these columns, I would come back to repeatedly, is about the size of effects. Because there is often a tendency in both the academic writing and then particularly when papers are written up in the mainstream or mass media to overemphasize the differences. So that a study might find a statistically significant difference between two things, but they are almost always differences of scale and not direction. So chocolate might make you canvass more in general, but it probably doesn't make you canvass that much more than without chocolate. And plenty of people who don't eat chocolate will canvass just as well. And there's a really good illustration in the book, actually, with a chapter on the cognitive abilities of Remain and Leave voters in the Brexit referendum,
you must have been tempted to make your life easier by not including that chapter.
I remember when someone suggested me writing it for the House magazine, and it was, do I really want to bring this, onto my head? But in the end I did, because it's a really good example of this effect. So this paper finds that Remain voters had higher cognitive abilities than Leave voters on average. And it finds this effect in couples as well. So if you had a couple in a relationship and their views on Brexit differed, the Remainer was usually the sharper one of the two. But these are differences of scale. They're not absolutes. If I said to you 9-year-olds are taller than 8-year-olds, you wouldn't for a minute think I was meaning that all 9-year-olds are taller than all 8-year-olds. You'd understand that there's a massive range there, and plenty of very, very tall 8-year-olds and plenty of very short 9-year-olds. And it's the same in this case. Over a third of Leave voters in this study had higher levels of cognitive ability than the average Remainer. And whilst the brighter person in the couple was more likely to be a Remainer than a Leave, the difference was 10 percentage points. So there were loads of couples where there was a difference in view on this. And bluntly, it was the Remainer who was a bit dim, and it was the Leaver who was the sharper of the two. And that nuance about scale, I think, is the single biggest thing when we come to read papers on politics that people get wrong. I find myself returning to the subject time and time again in the columns and in the book.
And I think, isn't that in part, or at least my impression is that in part is because academics are much more interested in, is something statistically significant in a difference? And if it is statistically significant in that sense, your paper or your research has proven something, job done, sort of tick. Whilst as a practitioner reading the research, I'm often interested in, well, what's the size of the effect?
Yes.
And I'm very struck how often academic papers will have, it's statistically significant. This is our conclusion. Hooray. And it's then really hard work to work out, okay, what are you telling me the scale is? So I've had this, for example, in the past with looking at papers about electoral systems and turnout, that there's a reasonably consistent pattern that proportional voting systems are associated with higher turnout. But what I really want to know is, if a particular voting system in the UK is going to be changed, what's the absolute, what's the average percentage change in turnout I should expect? Because if it's a very small number, you think, well, okay, actually, if turnout is your priority, there's 101 other things you probably want to try doing. So it matters. And yet the academics, it's as if academics almost are not interested in actually what is the scale.
I think there's a couple of things
big, of course.
I think so. So having said this is, it's my single biggest cautionary note, I think, in terms of how to read political science stuff. It's way bigger than my worries about outright fraud, for example, or mistakes or any of that. I think that's there, but it's trivial. This is the bigger one. It's that time and time again I read discussions of effects that don't really discuss the size of those effects, and part of it, I think, is the incentive to get published in an academic journal is often whether you've shown a difference or not. Yeah. Then there's the fact that when the paper gets cited, and a lot of research lives on in sort of secondary notes, to live on in someone's footnote is your greatest achievement. Usually by that point, it's become shrunken anyway. So, if I originally discovered, even if I originally said that chocolate increased turnout by 10 percentage points, by the time the finding is being reported by others, it's just gone down to chocolate increases canvassing. And I think that becomes particularly true if you're trying to get the research into the media and so on, because at that point they really are interested in the things that make it. That's the headline, right? But the scale of change, and this is again not something I'm particularly worried about in these chapters, because I think I chose carefully and well. But a common trick in newspapers is to say something has increased the effect by 100%, but it's increased it from 1% to 2%, and we can live with that one way or the other.
Yeah, I guess the chapter actually that made me doubt most what I was reading actually was for a slightly different reason, which was your chapter on trust. And I think there is an interesting story to tell about trust, one of which is if you look at, say, the long-running trends from Ipsos, their sort of trust index, they ask people about trust in different professions. The long-term trends are across most professions are actually fine. You don't look at the graph and think every line is dropping, oh my goodness, society is doomed. But I guess the doubt I have at the back of my mind, increasingly when I come across such work, is take estate agents. They normally come out very poorly from those sorts of measures, but people use estate agents for what is almost everyone who uses an estate agent. It is one of the, if not the biggest financial transaction in their life, if they're buying or selling a home. And although there's been a little bit with the rise of the internet of sort of making some parts of the process self-service, fundamentally estate agents are not an endangered profession in the way that other professions have become endangered by the rise of the internet and digital services and so on. And you sort of think, there's just something that doesn't seem to quite add up there about how the sorts of academic works that you draw on in your trust chapter are thinking about trust, given that basically we all say we don't trust estate agents, but here's a transaction involving several £100,000, which I'm quite happy for you to be involved in.
Well, I would say in response to that particular issue, I mean, if you are buying and selling your house solely using an estate agent and you haven't involved a solicitor and maybe a surveyor,
true,
you are in real trouble.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
we might trust the estate agent to do a bit of the process, but we then we get the solicitor and the surveyor to check that what we've been told is actually true. What I think is interesting, though, about these questions about trust, I do share with you some doubts about some of these questions. So, for example, the Mori one is whether you trust them to tell the truth. And I've often, I've seen things show that politicians score lower on that than hairdressers. But I mean, this strikes me as a sort of, what does it mean to expect my hairdresser to tell the truth?
I also find that one really weird because I find, maybe this is just my attitude towards my hair or the hairdressers that I've used over the years. I basically expect them to always tell me that my hair looks amazing and wonderful at the end of that. The basic setup is not one where I expect an honest appraisal at the end of it. So I don't understand why people rate hairdressers so high.
Let's just on this though. Let's start with the Ipsos trend, because I begin the book with the Ipsos data, and I use what is a fairly hackneyed trick in writing, which is that I say how shocking the data is with politicians being trusted by just 18% of the public, and then lo and behold, I reveal in chapter 2, and I hope I'm not spoiling this for anyone who might then go and buy the book, then in fact this is the data from the early 1980s, and in fact very little has changed over the intervening years. I mean, politicians were always at the bottom or near bottom of the Ipsos scores, and have remained there. Nothing has changed. The figures have bounced up a bit, but or down a bit, but they really have not shifted very much. And I always think when I read things like that, I'm very wary of discussions about how politicians in particular can regain trust, given that they never really had trust in the first place. But still, the chapter of discussion of trust, however, is based on a really impressive piece of work measuring thousands of different surveys, asking different questions about trust, and finding a pretty consistent trend that trust levels in representative institutions like Parliament are falling almost everywhere. And in fact, the British Parliament comes out slightly better than some others, in that the drop is not as big as in other places, although it's from a fairly low base. More generally, where I think things are a bit different is, so I'm not surprised politics scores low on measures of trust, and always has scored low on measures of trust, for two reasons, really. The first, and I'm going to be really careful how I phrase this, because I'm not going to accuse politicians of lying, because I don't like it when people accuse politicians of lying without being absolutely clear that's what they're doing. But more politely, I think I can say that obfuscation is a sort of fundamental part of politics, and maybe in a way that it's not in all other professions. I mean, although it's there in most, right? I mean, but if I'm a member of the cabinet and I'm asked on live TV what I think about a policy that actually I think is really stupid, I can't say it's really stupid. I have to sort of dodge and weave and get around it, because if I say it's really stupid, I've A, broken collective ministerial responsibility, and B, I've suddenly caused a story about a split. So
it's like the question about, do you want to be prime minister? Politicians so often
how do you
trouble
answer
by giving an honest
answer? If you're a conservative backbencher at the moment and someone asks you, what do you think of your leader? You know that for a lot of them, if they give an honest answer, suddenly there's a story running and they're really not being very helpful. So just that general level of obfuscation, I think, is a part of politics in a way that it maybe isn't in all other professions. The second aspect of politics, which is really different, is if you look at that list of professions, or indeed any list of professions, politics is one of the very few in which its participants routinely disparage the others on the basis of things like their honesty or their integrity. Professors might have a go at each other about the quality of their academic work, and people that run supermarkets say, come and shop with us because we sell good apples or whatever. But you don't tend to see Sainsbury putting an advert out saying Tesco's are a bunch of, scumbags and you shouldn't trust them. I mean, that's not the way it works. The same thing for hairdressers. So that intra sort of politics dispute, which focuses often explicitly on someone's integrity and their values, exists in politics in a way it doesn't in any of these other professions. So it's hardly surprising that the public notice that.
And yeah, I guess plumbers are probably the one profession which stereotypically, every plumber always looks at the plumbing and says, "Oh, I wouldn't have done it like that." But politicians are quite rare in that respect.
Last time I had a plumber around, he stuck his head under the sink and said, "Oh, whoever's done this has done a really good job." And I remember thinking at the time, this must be a one-off, right?
Yeah.
But even then, they're not slagging off a particular plumber. If you see what I mean, they're just effectively bigging themselves up or creating some wriggle room. It's not quite the same.
And there's one other, continuing with the theme of things in the book that made me think, because I thought, oh, I'm not quite sure I agree with that, which I think is actually a very good sign for a book, by the way. It's not, I think a book that simply tells you everything that you thought you already knew is, you might say, well, why read it? It was your comment about the personal vote of MPs, which isn't the main focus of a chapter, but you do have a passing comment that the personal vote of an incumbent MP is worth a couple of percentage points. I suspect there'll be quite a few people listening to this podcast who have sort of, delivered thousands of leaflets, knocked on hundreds of doors and thought, nah, surely it wasn't all worth it. And I do think that there is a serious point that, that sort of throwaway comment is not, is fairly typical of what other academic, comments other academics, make. And I think fits with a lot of the research there is with field experiments there have been to try to measure campaign effects of particular campaign techniques, etc. The answer is always a small number of sort of percentage points, pretty much. But certainly people who are active in campaigning have a very strong belief that no, and turning up to do a campaign where you've done no campaign before, or having a really good quality candidate can move things by 10, 15, 20 percentage point, that there's a huge order of magnitude difference, as it were, between my possibly delusional self-belief as to what, say, I and colleagues can achieve and what academics, seem to conclude. So what's is your view basically that people like me are just, believing our own hype? Or is there stuff going on?
No, I don't know. So first of all, there's actually quite a lot in the book about the importance of campaigning. I mean, the people that go out armed with a comfy shoes, a thick coat, and a pile of leaflets, this has electoral payoffs. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about that. I cover that in a couple of chapters.
And don't forget the spatula. I think it's essential for difficult letterboxes. Have your spatula ready.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really important finding, and one which I cover at some length. I think maybe, however, what's happening here is a conflation between a couple of things. So one is what we call the personal vote of the MP, and the other would be campaign effects, and the other might be sort of demographic effects in the constituency. So the first thing to note would be that whilst I say, the personal vote of an incumbent MP is usually worth a couple of percentage points, studies have often found that for Liberal Democrat MPs in the past, that figure has been higher. So Tim Smith's study in 2013 found that it was between 5 and 15% Lib Dems. I mean, on a par with a US member of the US Congress. Second, that personal vote is not the same thing as the overall variability of the party's vote share. So the party might be doing well in one area, but less well in other areas. There's lots of things that can drive that, right? I mean, Lib Dems, for example, or other parties sometimes have very targeted campaigns. You might be targeting one area, not in the other, which would be driving up your vote in one place. The demographics of the seat, and so on. The personal vote is the percentage of the vote that is allocated to the incumbent MP because they are the incumbent MP, because of who they are and the fact that they're the incumbent. So if they stand down and they're replaced by an MP of the same party, how much does the vote go down, right? Now, obviously, there are other intervening variables, and they're controlled for in studies of these things. But, if you take, I don't know, Yeovil, for example, when Paddy Ashdown stood down, the vote didn't collapse because of Paddy Ashdown. David Laws comes in, the vote did drop a bit. Then David Laws grew it again a bit. We wouldn't say that all of that vote that Paddy Ashdown had, that had grown that seat over multiple elections, was Paddy Ashton's personal vote. It was the result of multiple campaigns in that seat. Personal vote is the effect of the MP being Paddy Ashton. When the MP ceased to be Paddy Ashton, the Lib Dem vote in that seat remained high. And it's no surprise that now, of the seats that Lib Dems have regained, Yeovil is one of them. So I think I understand the point. What is important, I think, just in general, is when we talk about the personal vote of the MP, it's also to realise that has multiple components. So again, I talk in the book about, this covers things like whether they got a beard or not, whether they're attractive, but also how hard they work for and in the constituency.
And for people who don't know Phil, I should say that Phil does currently have a beard, so therefore I'm assuming...
I do currently have a beard, and therefore I will not be standing for elected office anytime soon. It's one of the many reasons I will not be standing for elected office anytime soon. But, do they have a beard? Do they work hard in the constituency? How do they vote? On which, by the way, all the evidence is that how they vote makes almost no difference at all to their electoral survival or lack thereof.
And so I think we can probably squeeze in talking about one other chapter. So turning to another chapter that sort of made me sort of stop and think, but in a rather different way, is you've got a really interesting chapter on the history of riots in British elections, which I thought methodologically sort of stands out as being an example of the sort of research that advances in computer technology is beginning to make much more possible. So do you want to say a little bit about that chapter first?
Yeah, I love this chapter, and I love the original paper when it was published. It is, as you say, it's about riots or violent disturbances more generally in late Victorian elections, and it uses the fact that now we are able to search digitized records of national and importantly local newspapers in a way that would not have been possible for historians 20 or 30 years ago. I mean, it searches literally billions of words in the archives to come up with these various incidents. And it finds that late Victorian elections were incredibly bloody, really quite violent, much more violent than we have ever understood before, much more violent than any of the previous studies indicated. In the 1868 election, for example, there were 39 riots, 39 election riots in one election, over 300 other violent incidents, which led to 17 deaths. And those 17 deaths included a woman and child who died from bayonet wounds when the army was called out to put down one of these riots. 1868 does not stand out particularly as excessively violent compared to the other elections that follow. And it is not really until the early 20th century that that level of violence ceases. The other thing that's really nice about that paper is that it shows that the violence that does occur in late Victorian elections is not, as had previously been thought, sort of bottom-up rowdiness. It's often deliberately utilized by the political parties as a strategic tool to send in thugs to break up rival meetings or beat up party workers, and that each party would then in turn employ other thugs to defend themselves against people that would come in. It's a lovely piece of work which would not have been possible 20 or 30 years ago. And it makes the point that one of the reasons that historians had previously not been able to notice this was that these riots or incidents of violence were so common that they were often buried away on sort of inside pages in newspapers, and therefore they'd been missed. And only now, because the archives are digitized, have we been able to get full access to them.
Yeah. I mean, reading that chapter reminded me of my experience, one of my experiences with writing my own PhD, which was at the time when the British Library had just introduced a computerized catalogue. And so searching for pamphlets written about the debates leading up to the Great Reform Act in 1832, because I could type in keywords, I was finding all sorts of pamphlets that the British Library had got and that were available to read still, but that nobody had looked at for centuries, because they weren't the ones that everyone cited. And if you didn't know the ones that people had cited, you didn't know which pamphlet to ask the British Library. But now when you've got a digital catalogue that you could search, suddenly new things open up. And it just struck me that, I mean, I know Caitlin Milazzo and colleagues do some really good work at gathering election leaflets and tagging the data in various ways and analysing them. But the rate at which these tools, particularly AI-related tools, are developing means, it would be possible, probably is just about possible now, certainly would be possible in the future, to start asking questions like, you've yourself have done work about the importance of candidates describing themselves as local and how that seems to get more votes. But is the way in which people describe themselves as local,
Yeah.
is that evolving? So my hunch would be, but completely without evidence, is that 50 years ago, being local was much more often related to your place of work than it is now, because you would have a particular dominant local employer where, oh, you work at the coal mine. That's how you show your local creds and how you understand the community, in a way that there are many fewer workplaces now where you go. But that question, maybe that's true, maybe it's not. If you've got a digitized set of election leaflets that you can run automated tools on, you can begin to try to answer those questions in a way that before it would have to be a lifetime of a poor graduate research.
Some of these things would literally have been impossible given the reality of research funding or budgets, and a combination of both digitization, which itself has led to huge advances because it removes a lot of the grunt work, and then in now the development of AI are really going to make some of these projects doable in a way that they just weren't doable before. It's a bit like that. There's that line in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy about the Earth being mostly harmless, and I think when it comes to AI, I think in terms of research terms, it will be mostly positive. It will be incredibly useful as a research tool. I mean, obviously, we're all well aware of some of the flaws, but then there are flaws using humans to do research work as well, and it can do that sort of really basic grind stuff really quite well already. I mean, let alone where we are in sort of 5 or 10 years' time. I do have one cautionary note about it, though, and I think this is also true. This is true already of digitalization, and I think it will be true of AI. There is often some value in the sort of main researcher, or at least whoever's driving the project, having got their hands dirty.
Absolutely, yeah.
With actual primary research, or I see this with Parliament stuff, research on Parliament all the time. It means you have understood what's actually happening and can then interpret the data in a useful way. And very occasionally, thankfully not too often, but occasionally I do read pieces of work where someone has done something very clever, where they've been able to scrape material off the web, particularly say off the Parliament website. They've chucked it all into some fantastically clever database, run some advanced statistics on it, but actually they've missed what's going on. They've missed what the thing that is actually happening on the ground, because they haven't really understood the data they're looking at. But as long as they can do that and then use AI, I mean, all to the good.
Yeah, you're tempting me to get into my usual topic about the reliance that academic research often makes on the level of constituency expenditure as a measure.
No, because we don't need to go there, because we agree 100%. We agree 100%. It is the worst example of using the data that is there rather than the data that will actually be useful.
Yeah, but to end with a sort of a completely different example, one thing that's really struck me since I joined the House of Lords is the Lords is normally described as being a self-regulating chamber, so very different from the Commons where the Speaker is in charge. But actually, at least since COVID lockdowns, I understand it was different prior to that, but in the last few years, actually, in a way, it's the government chief whip who does the role of the Speaker. So in the Lords, the government chief whip will often point to who's meant to speak next, etc. And there's just an subtlety of how the Lords operates that I suspect, in part, obviously, there's a lag time because this isn't how it always was, and so accounts haven't crept up. But also, I suspect there's a fair number of people writing about the Lords where if they were just sat in the public gallery for an hour or two on a random day, they would pick up. And so I absolutely agree with you. There's some real value in understanding what's happening at the coalface, even if you then do lots of clever things. But it does all make me very much hope that A, your book is massively successful because it's a really fun read and it should be, but B, therefore you get to write a volume 2 in a few years' time where a whole load of new research will have been done with digitization and AI tools. And it feels like there's quite a reason to be quite optimistic or excited even about how political science might develop in that way.
So just to say that when I began this column, a more cynical colleague of mine said that I would run out of stuff to write about. He said, we're not producing enough interesting. We're not producing enough interesting stuff for you to get a piece every 2 weeks. And I have to say it's exactly the opposite. I always have far more to write about than I have the space to write about.
So one final question. So most of the listeners to this podcast are Lib Dems. So if you had one bit of advice based on all of the research that you read for the book, whether it made it into the book or not, if you had one bit of advice for Liberal Democrats, what would you kindly proffer?
Page 103. Those Lib Dem winning here signs work. Local campaigning works. Leaflets work. Leaflets are actually what people most want. It's still the biggest expenditure of campaign material in elections, and they are what comes top of what the public say they want to have from political parties. Being local matters, so stress that, and potholes matter. So there's plenty in the book.
I love
Lib
that
Dem.
bit. Yeah.
It's a book which includes the importance of potholes. What more can Liberal Democrats want?
Absolutely. So I will include links in the show notes to whether people are listeners are Lib Dems or not, but anyone who's interested in potholes absolutely should get the book for that reference, if nothing else. So thank you hugely for your time, Phil. People can find Phil on Blue Sky at philipjcowley.bsky.social, while I am markpackuk.bsky.social. As I said, I'll include links in the show notes to get your own copy of Phil's book, and also to a free chapter from the book, which with Phil's kind agreement appeared in my Lib Dem Newswire newsletter earlier in the year. And if you like listening to this episode, please do tell others about the podcast and give it a rating or review in your favourite podcast app. Thank you, everyone, for listening.